Did you always know you wanted to be a poet?
I was the child of, an only child, and my mother and father had a difficult relationship. My mother had a series of nervous breakdowns. So I ended up spending a lot of time alone and writing. I think when I was 8 or 9, I just started to write things down, and it became an ally. So I wouldn't say I knew I wanted to be a poet, but I knew that writing, I actually can't even say I knew, I just needed the writing opportunity to voice my experiences and to actually feel spoken to by other voices. And that in some ways sustained me as a young person. And then in college, I sort of claimed the idea of poet and began to write more seriously. I did write some in high school. But then I spent, it was very important to me to find a way to be financially sufficient and to get out of the house. And so I became a high school English teacher, which was wonderful for me, and I thought it would allow me time to write. But for 18 years, I was a teacher in Berkeley Unified School District and staunchly involved in the union, and there really wasn't time for my own poetry. Right. But I was one of those teachers who always said, follow your heart. Don't let money and ambition for security drive you away from your heart's desire. And at some point in those last few years, that started to really stick in my throat, because I felt more and more that although I used poetry in the classroom and I read voraciously, I hadn't done exactly what I was telling them to do. And I realized that I couldn't keep telling them that and not hurt myself more and more with that energy. If I got into St. Mary's and I got the sabbatical, I was going to go back for another degree with an MFA to work with Brenda Hillman, whose work I greatly admire. And I got it. And then once I spent the first semester, I was going to actually go back in the second semester and do both, and I just didn't want to do it. Yeah. As much as the high school work and the union work was critical to my development as a thinking, caring human in a social sphere, I needed to follow my avocation.
What about publishing? Can you tell us the story behind Omnidon?
You know, there are things that one talks about, but that one on some level doesn't think will actually happen. And one of the things that my husband often would talk about is to have a sailboat. And, you know, but we never quite did that. And he'd talk about wanting to start a small press, because both of us feel that the overarching publishing industry is containing ideation in this culture in ways that are horrifically frightening to us. And we both feel strongly that we wanted to be part of the system that works against that, to bring as many ideas as possible into fruition. So I never thought we'd do anything about it, you know. And so I was finishing up my MFA, which we'd borrowed money for, and he and I had the good luck of having Lynn Haginian as my last workshop instructor, and she pushed something that was very important to Brenda, but she pushed it in a slightly different way. She said, if you want to be published, you need to understand the publishing industry, and you need to serve other writers before you can expect to be served. And her analogy was, if you want to be invited to the best parties, you had darn well better learn how to give one. Which I thought was a spicy comment, and I brought it home to Ken, and I said, easy for Lynn Haginian to say this, you know, at this point in her career. I mean, she's run a lot of small presses. And he got that crazy look in his eye, and he said, you know, maybe it's the time for us to do this. So we started Omnidon. on 2 wings and 25 cents from MasterCard. And so far the bird is flying.
What about the background behind the name? I know you asked us about LandEscapes, and Omnidon
did.
is also very interesting. So
Again, this is Ken's name.
Okay.
When he was in college, he went to San Jose State, and Buckminster Fuller was a visiting scholar there. And although Ken didn't take classes directly, he sat in on a number of the seminars and went to a lot of the special programs that were offered when he was there. And he saw the domes and this whole idea of the dome and this whole concept of sort of not a square linear comportment of idea or space or energy, but a free-flowing movement. And so he got the name in his mind of Omnidome. So this name Omnidome had been with him for years. And Omnidome didn't seem like the right name for a press, but it was so much in his heart space for the idea of starting something in this way. And then he was driving and he saw this truck for a bakery that was something Dawn. And he thought, Omnidon, which fit in a way the sense of ours, which is that we want many and in all directions and in all ways, sort of omnipresent enlivening of the spirit. And that's what we want all the work that we publish to be for the readers and for us. It's really how we pick work, is work that lights us up and awakens something, some level of dawning within us. So
sounds
that's
perfect.
where it came from.
So on that note, you said what inspires you a little bit, but what inspires you as a poet, as a writer, as a publisher? Question.
What I would say, in terms of what we publish, I'm very open in terms of content, but I'm looking for that spark, that synergy. Agamben would call it poesis, but I'm looking for the arrival of something that previously, I'm looking for ways to break my frame of attention so that I can open to more things. What does that for me as a writer can be any number of possibilities. What has happened to me in my career is that often those experiences that I can't grasp, that I struggle with, are those things that inspire me to write. 2 of my books are focused on death. My parents died within just about a year of each other, and my relationship with both of them was complicated, and dealing with the aftermath of the deaths was complicated. And so for me, really, the writing sustained a relationship to their presence in my life, so that I could keep, in some sense, recreating that relationship and forgiving myself and forgiving them and understanding. I mean, I was raised Catholic. I'm not a practicing Catholic. I'm not Catholic now, but I think I had instilled within me a sense of a presence beyond the material world. Although I often have questioned that relationship. I have great questions about organized religion, although I have great respect for everyone's choices. For me personally, that choice was fraught. Maybe because of its relationship to my parents. It's always hard to say what's cause and what's effect. But after each death, I had such a changed sense. I mean, in both cases, I was able to spend some time with the body. Both my parents died in hospital or in rest home, and so I was there for my father's death, and I was there shortly after my mother's death. And there's a way that everything shifted for me being in that room, in those rooms, and different in each experience. But that presence of absence, that absence in presence, which is words that I've heard many people say, but that didn't have any filament truth to them until I experienced it. A sense of life's amplification almost. And then I found that energy in nature in a way that I never understood before. I never had that kind of relationship with nature until, or that level of relationship. I've always had, I think, I've always had my relationship to nature, but this shifted it and changed it. And so,
so I guess this kind of touches on that as well. What has been your greatest challenge, as a writer, creatively, academically, in general?
well, I think what I just talked about
is pretty much
is facing into the fear. Fear, panic, those are issues that are enormous for me as an only child in a dysfunctional family. I struggled with fear and panic on intimate levels, and I think as a teenager probably didn't deal with them very effectively. Dealt with them in maybe destructive ways or dysfunctional ways. And my greatest challenge as an individual is to turn that energy, which is enormous in me, which is an integral part of who I am as a being in this life, in this lifetime, and find ways to work with it. And so for me, writing is the way that I face my fears and open myself to what panic can shift entirely around for me. So, and there are, unfortunately, at least for me, and maybe I think for most people, those areas in life where there's always a point of panic or a point of fear. Those places of challenge are what I seek, actually. But that's kind of tricky to say because, if I had a choice, would I maybe just want a kinder and gentler experience? I don't think I have that choice to make, so it's good because I don't know if I'd have the courage to choose, to keep choosing. But when struggle presents itself and fear presents itself, I know that the writing is a way to move in a healthy way because, we're constantly bombarded in this culture by unhealthy ways of dealing with panic and fear, whether it's substance or the substance of television or food or, I don't have to name them. We know what they are. And they're constantly at us as ways to supposedly ameliorate those problems, but those problems are only there to a larger degree. So, and I'm as tempted as anyone else. So the writing has been a sustaining force for me.
So how do you read a poem? What are your tricks? What are your tips? How do you know when poetry is good?
In a good way, I am enamored of poems that panic me a little bit. And I've actually written about this. There's an essay that Pleiades published that's probably available on their website still, called Poetry and Panic. And I really seek in lines and in language those places where at first I feel the floor is pulled out from under me, and then I find a way to swim again, or to maybe it's not a floor anymore, it's an ocean. So now I'm gonna be swimming, or maybe it gives me, the poem gives me wings so I can fly even though it's dropped me off a cliff. I'm sure it's just part of who I am as a person, but the poems that don't arrest me or don't alter my state of energy, I can read and I can enjoy and I can respect, but they aren't the ones I go back to. It's interesting, when I was debating about going to graduate school, it was Brenda Hillman's book Death Tractates and her book Bright Existence. And it's ironic to me that Death Tractates, which is about the death of a dear friend, is a book that was so moving to me. And then later in my life, I would write, and I'd end up writing about death because we're very different poets. But those books, I go back to them, and they're new again for me because those places that they throw me off balance, as an older person with different experiences under my belt, I find different ground to return to. So they remain catalysts or engines of surprise, that's the work that I find most exciting.
So, last question. What advice do you have for current students in becoming professionals, professional poets, publishers, writers? Yeah.
I'm constantly, and this, to be absolutely frank, at finding the complex constraints of one to the other. Publishing exacts so much time. And I always want to give more time to my writing. And as a writer, my job, I think, is to, at least to some degree, step away from cultural norms and market appeal and follow my own path. Not worry about what the last book looked like or sounded like or who read it, because the next book has to be my own, and I can't sort of try to write to that audience. The publisher has to, I believe, if we want our publishing work to sustain itself, create an audience and worry about exactly those things. How is Omnidon continuing to reach an audience that they can trust what our imprint means? And I have to look at market share, and I have to look at how books are faring financially. So those are, in some ways, one would think, opposing forces or belief systems or hierarchies. But I subscribe, and I keep reminding myself that I subscribe to this. Agamben has a wonderful essay in his book Profanations. It's called, the essay is called Profanations, or to profane that which is sacrosanct. I think we live in an incredibly complicated, challenging world, and maybe every generation feels that. But I think that as writers, we have to trust that every day, every hour, we're going to be making very difficult choices, but that to sustain the writing is to keep those choices even as part of the writing process, and those frustrations as part of the writing process, and to simply not give up. So I guess the other piece of advice, personal advice to myself and advice to others, is to never think that you're too old or done with, or that you cannot. That to listen to those little pieces of energy that come at you and say, but, or maybe, and to let new poems come in that way, and to let new opportunities come in that way. So I think that's the best advice I can give from my own personal experience.